corner here. I'm very pleased to be here presenting this. Sometimes I speak quite quickly, so if you'd like me to repeat anything, just let me know, okay? What I'm going to do in this first session between now and 10:30 is go through an introduction to research and the research process. So we've set 4 objectives. The first objective won't take us very long. We'll start with the research process and what are the main steps. Then objectives 2 and 3 I'll spend most time on, about how you set up problems, how you understand setting up research questions to guide your research. Then writing a purpose statement. You must be able to write a very clear statement what your research is about and why it is important. So we'll focus on that, and then the last couple of minutes, just a couple of minutes, I'll wrap up by talking about bringing that together and putting it into a proposal for research. Okay? So, to get started, the first objective, thinking about the research process, what is it? When you say you're doing research, what are you talking about? Now, students often say, well, you know, I find some information. I went to the library and I found some information. I learned a lot. In fact, that's just information gathering. You might learn some skills in accessing information. You might find out some things that are of interest to you. But it doesn't have a specific objective. When you do research, you are trying to find something in particular. You're following a path that takes you to an end point that you have set at the beginning. Now, this is particularly so in quantitative methods, and I'll come back to that. Qualitative is more open-ended and more loose, but you need to have an idea of where you're going because there's a lot of pathways out there and you can get very lost. I'm sure you all understand that once you get started. So it's not information gathering. Research is not taking information or facts from one place and putting them into another. Why not? Someone might say, I've written a paper on something. That's okay, that's fine. That's a student assignment to go and find some information, think about it and put it together. But you're taking it to the next level. When you do research, you're not just finding out about something, you're doing something with that information. All right? So when you go and look up facts, you might be finding out, you know, using techniques of research, finding out how to do the process, how to do it. You might just be transcribing information, but if you are doing real research, you need to interpret it. What does it mean? What does this information mean? And that's the next step in your thinking process that turns you from being a student in business or whatever you're in to a researcher, that you actually do the hard thinking. Let me tell you, students don't like doing it. They come here and I say, go away and do some thinking, do some work. I've done all this work, I've got 50 pages of summaries. But you don't know what the summaries mean. What do the summaries mean in terms of knowledge and going forward or business problems? So you have to actually take it and do something. All right, that's enough. Let's come to the research process. I tried to find a definition of the research process. And when you go and look, they're all very complicated. They all seem to say lots and lots of things. But the key things seem to be research is a procedure, so it is a process that you go through. It needs to be systematic, no matter what type of research you're doing. If it's quantitative, it needs to be based on, well, this author says fact. That's arguable because we never really prove anything, we just disprove other things. But anyway, we'll leave that. And it's an answer to a question. So when I was looking through definitions of research, the research process, these are the sorts of words or terms that you come up with. It's got to be organised, it's got to be systematic, it's got to be data-based, it's got to be critical, objective, scientific, it's got to investigate a specific problem or issue. It needs to have a precise purpose. Now this is business research. If you look at this, I've put these in an order here, quite deliberately. The first 4, organised, systematic, data-based and critical, apply to all types of research. Any type of research that you do must follow those, must have those 4 characteristics. When you move into these, objective, scientific, specific problem and decision making, we're talking about applied business research. And there's a slight difference. If you're doing a qualitative study where you want to explore something, it maybe won't be very objective, because you might be involved in interviews or you might be part of a group or whatever, so it becomes subjective. So it's quite confusing when you first start trying to separate these things out. But coming to the important point, all the research that you do needs to be organised, systematic, data-based and critical. Now, data might be secondary data. It might be something that someone else has done that you're using, but you're not making it up. It's got to come from somewhere. One of the mistakes that many of my students have made in the past is they'll make up hypotheses or make up things. And well, where does this come from? Who said this? Oh, that's what I think it's going to be. Well, we have to be very humble. We have to say, what scholars have tested this, or what scholars have looked at this? And yes, it's good to have ideas about it, but we need to place ourselves in the body of knowledge related to where we're working. I'll come back to that. All right, so I've just taken this from a marketing research book, which some of you may know. It's by an American called Malhotra. And basically, he says there are always 6 steps. You must always follow these 6 steps. The first one, you set up your problem. What is it? Then you go into the literature. You come up with your design, collect and report your data. Then number 5, the important one, analyse and interpret. Think about, what does this data mean? And then you write a report. If you look at this, when we do business research, I always say to my students, there are 2 things about it. One is action, right, and the other is information. The first step is about action. It's that the problem, research problems in business tend to come from managers wanting to know what to do. So, for example, some research that I did a long time ago, I was working with some companies in Australia, and one of them said, we've got very great problems with frontline service employees being absent. That's a problem. It's a management problem. Employee absenteeism. The service, the frontline worker. Manager wanted to know, what action will I take? What's the action I should do? What do we have to do as researchers? First of all, we say, well, what do we know already about people and absenteeism? What do we know about frontline workers? And then, when we understand what's already been discovered, we can say, well, what's different in this situation, or what are the questions that we need to pursue in relation to this group? So I'll come back to that several times. If you're talking about applied business problems, managers want to know what actions they should take. We as researchers want to know what information we should gather to enable them to make good decisions. All right, moving on. So if I said to you, all right, what is research about? What have you got to do? The first thing, you need to have some sort of fairly big goal. So the goal leads you to a question. Usually you have a fairly big question that you break down into more manageable sub-questions, or whatever you want to call them. Some people call them objectives or aims or sub-problems. It doesn't matter. But you have a guiding overall problem, which is usually the title of your work. Then you bring it down into some sub-problems. That should lead you to a specific plan of action. Once you know what the problems are that you want to answer, then you can develop a plan in relation to them. Until you've got those questions sorted, it's very hard to decide what plan to take. Now, here, coming back to quantitative and qualitative research, if we're looking at quantitative research, we have hypotheses or propositions, and we use what the scientific people like to call hard, measurable data. We go out and we get numbers, right? If you're doing qualitative research, we're looking for insights and meaning. So we go out and we get words. We go out and talk to people or find out and try and develop ideas in a different way. One is essentially based on numbers, the other is essentially based on words. And of course, when you answer one question, then you think, well, you know, this has brought up some other questions, and it keeps going. And when you look at academic papers, it's often very useful. You read the introduction, what was this paper about, what were people trying to achieve? Then when you read the conclusion at the end, they say, well, this is what we found out. Now, the next thing we want to know that has arisen from this research is whatever. And in fact, that's the frustration of it, that you get to the end, but you're never at the end. Never ever at the end, because there's always something else. I like to present the research process like this. This is the way that I do it with my students. It has the same 6 steps. We look at the problem, what does that give us? That's the action. What's the information that we need to gather? What do we need to know in terms of theory? How are we going to find out? Collect the data. Then there's 2 steps here. Analyse the data and produce findings, and interpret the findings and draw conclusions. Yesterday I was on the plane coming from Paris, and I was reviewing a paper. And one of the great frustrations when you're reviewing a paper is the authors just repeat what's in the tables. These authors had done quite a good job, quite a nice study. They'd done very rigorous analysis, reported it very well, but they didn't say what it means. They said, you know, women were 60% or something, and blah, 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 and there was a link between some. So what does that mean? And that's the hard thinking that I was referring to. You've got to be able to interpret the findings and draw conclusions to have good research. And this is where students, well, not students, everyone finds it difficult. But you can see I've split that up into 5A and 5B, because I think it's really important. When you get your findings, you've got your data, now what does this mean? And I'll come back to that, because you have to say what it means for 2 groups. One, for theory, what does it mean for academics and knowledge and publications, and what does it mean for managers? The practical applications. And then we go back to the original problem, getting confused with too many things here. All right, where I'm taking you today is only through this part, really. I'm really looking in number 2, mainly, in this session this morning. And we're going to end this morning with the proposal. Well, my session at 10:30 with the proposal. Hopefully you won't feel so bad that you have to end your morning at that time. That's a joke, everybody. So we're moving through to get to the detailed proposal, where you can be confident about putting together a very high quality proposal. Then, when you've done the rest of the steps in the research, you can write your detailed report. Okay? So, and then it goes on in that sort of circular pattern.
Alison, probably you might want to let me remind you, there are some students who will be writing their master's dissertation, so it may not be necessarily very theoretical.
Okay.
So you may want to touch on that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you can be guided by your advisor or supervisor to how much emphasis you need to put on the various steps. If you're doing your master's dissertation, it's still very useful to think about what's the problem, the action, therefore what's the information we need, how are we going to gather that information. If you're doing a PhD or you're doing research as a scholar working in a university or college, you need to be much more confident about the theory that you're using and adding to. Okay, just cutting. All right, let's move on to objective number 2, which is about problems, hypotheses, and getting started on the research process. When you start a project, I don't understand the situation here. Are you told what to do? Or do you have to come up with an idea?
No, we have to have our own idea.
You have to have your own idea. And
or area that we want to research.
It's hard, isn't it? You know, when I was a very, very young person, a very, very long time ago, I did a science degree first. And when you do a science degree, at least in Australia at that time, they told you, you have to do this. Well, my advisor said, you will do this problem, you will use this equipment, blah, 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 and you must report it in scientific method. That's fine. I went on, did other things, worked in industry, came back into the academic world when I was 40-something. That's a secret, I won't tell you exactly. And I said, one of the conditions was that I had to do a master's project when I came into the university. That was fine. So I was assigned a supervisor, and I went to the supervisor and said, what do you want me to do? He said, no, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know. What am I going to do? And he said, no, you've got to go away and tell me what you want to do, not me telling you what to do. And I found that really difficult. I found it really difficult. And I've thought about it often with our students, because all the way through their undergrad degrees, we tell them, you must do this assignment, you must answer the question, you must meet these requirements, you must list 5 references, or you must cite these people. Then, when you become a research student, they say, what do you want to do? And we haven't sort of trained ourselves in thinking about what we want to do or how we might find out about it. So it is quite challenging, and I think don't be discouraged if you find it difficult at first, because it is difficult. Okay, how do you get research ideas? They can come from all over the place, excuse me. If you're very lucky, someone will say to you, there is a gap in the literature on something or other, and you can pursue it. That tends to be more unusual than where you have to actually identify things yourself. You know, it might be you're working, or you've worked, or you talk to someone in industry, you have an idea of a problem. There might be some debate. In Australia, there's been a lot of work done lately on green marketing. People are interested in environment. There might be something like that that's happening. Pardon me. So somehow or other you come up with a vague area that you're going to look at or that you think about. Then you have to do your work to find out, well, what exactly is the problem or the overall research question that I want to pursue. So you think about these things, and they might be mixed up. So you come up with a first cut or a first draft of your question, and that will often change as you get more thinking about what's being done. You start thinking about what other people have done. When you've got your problem settled, then you can come up with your research design. Okay? And this is essentially what we do in a proposal. You think about what needs to be done or what we'd like to do. You might have done some study, you might love relationship marketing, so you say, well, I want to do something in relationship marketing. So you go talk to your advisor or do some work. I'm not sure how it would happen here, but if you were my student, I would say, well, let's bring it down a bit. What specifically has appealed to you about it? Let's do a search with those keywords and find out what are the leading scholars saying in the latest papers. Go and get the last 2 papers that you can find in relationship marketing in a particular area and see what they said needs to do. What's the future research? So you get a feel for where you want to go, and this is the design in a sense is a really, it's like nice when you get to the design part, because then it's more manageable, more controllable in the way you can go through and structure it and do what you want to do. Sometimes you don't have any say. You're sponsored, and you have to do what the sponsor wants you to do. And I'll give you an example of one of my past PhD students in a minute. She was sponsored, so she had to do spatial technology. She didn't have any choice about it. She's Malaysian. She got sponsored to study in Australia, but that was the deal. That was the company. So sometimes, you know, you don't have any say about it. That's okay. It's a question of where your motivation is, what you're interested in, what you're seeing, or your circumstances. And all of them are quite legitimate and quite okay. You then get into it. All right, this session is not about doing a literature review, but I just wanted to put one slide in to emphasise that the literature review is really important. For those of you who are doing a PhD or you're working as academics, the literature review has 2 key things. The first thing is what we already know. And you'll be able to guess what the last thing is. What have we got to find out? And so what I've put here is I've just put a little bit of a summary about the literature review. The literature review is good because you don't just go and gather information. You actually bring your work down to a couple of areas. All right? So let's say you're doing relationship marketing and you're interested in customer commitment. Right? So you bring it down, and then you read something on customer commitment and you say, actually it's really about the link between trust and commitment. So you've got a couple of areas that you can then search. The literature review enables you to find out about those. And so basically, it enables you then to work on specific theories. So you don't have to read hundreds of things. You bring it down to the things that are going to affect your own work. Really importantly, the literature review needs to tell the reader about the issues of debates. Students, when they do it, and I did this too, I was so upset when I did my masters, you know, when I was saying when I couldn't find a topic, I found a topic, I did a literature review, sent it to my supervisor, and he sent it back and said, I'm not reading it. You haven't done a literature review. I said, I have. He said, no, what you've done is a series of summaries. You've just listed, this author said this author said that, this author found something else. I said, I don't know what you mean. He said, what you have to do is integrate the literature. It's not just a list of summaries. You have to say, what are the arguments? What are the debates? What are the themes that run through those? And that's the real literature review. You start with summaries, and then you think, what are they all talking about? Or what are the key themes that come out of this? And then you do what I would call a real literature review. All right? And that's the series of summaries. So, the literature review, start with what we know already. And then finish, what do we need to find out? What do we need to find out? So, some years ago I did some work on senior consumers in shopping. Everything in the literature tells us that senior consumers don't like to take risks. We know that. As you get older, you like to feel secure and you're not young and free and out there. Why would I want to explore that? We already know it. All right? I might use it in some way, but I don't need to find out because it's already known. I might want to test that, how strong it is in relation to something specific. The literature tells you those things. So for those of you doing a PhD, the literature review is really important. All right, here's an example for you. I was working with the company, I was said before, I was going to refer back to it. They have a problem with frontline staff being away, employee absenteeism. What did I do? I went to the literature to see what we knew already. And it was pretty straightforward. There were various things in the literature. They said, you know, if the employees stay away, if they're too pressured, if there's role conflict, if they have a problem with the pressure of the work, management attitudes, a whole range of things. So we were able to develop a survey, execute the survey. One of the things we asked was about their stress level. I hope you can you read that? Let's read that. And what does this tell you? So this was one of the questions. This was in a call centre. What's your stress compared to previous jobs that you've had? And so they had to tick a scale. And what did we find? Quite a small sample, 139. We found that more than half that group said that the work they were doing was more stressful or much more stressful than previous work. Now that was something interesting. We know that stress affects absenteeism, so that wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise is that they found this much more stressful. So what did we do? We did follow-on focus groups to say, why is it more stressful than other work? And were there any other reasons that we didn't already know from the literature? So we confirmed a lot that had already been established, but we found out some other things as well. The last thing to note on this slide is, see how this was quantitative research. The literature told us quite a lot. So we were able to survey employees, have a look at the findings, but then we needed to do some qualitative research to explore why that was the case. We checked, we find out, then we did qual to explore. All right, I'm using the terms qualitative and quantitative quite a lot. I'm assuming that you understand these and know about them. So I've just made one summary, one slide summary, just in case anyone is just starting on this and doesn't know. When we do qualitative research, you are exploring, you're looking for the themes, looking for insights, looking for meaning. So it's relatively unstructured, it's small samples, and it uses words. You use words to get the data and to summarise the data. Most importantly, qualitative work uses open questions. How, why, please explain. And it's intended essentially to build theory. Now, there are lots of different types of qualitative research, and it's a very big area. This is a sort of a big picture overview. How does that compare to quantitative? And quantitative research is said to be explanation, not exploration. We are explaining what happens by testing links. We're looking at theoretical models and testing links between variables. So it's highly structured. We tend to have large samples. We use numbers. We generally use stats. And what we're doing is testing or confirming a theory, essentially. So this is, when I'm talking about qualitative and quantitative, this is the basic distinction that I've made. All right, here's another example of a study that I've done in the past. What do seniors value in shopping experiences? When I went into the literature and looked at literature around senior consumers, older consumers, and retail, there was very little literature. There was literature based on younger consumers, young families, but very little that specifically looked at the older consumer. And in just about everywhere in the world, population is ageing, people are living longer, they've got more money, companies wanted to try and get their money. So we wanted to find out, what do they value? So this required a qualitative design in the first instance. The literature doesn't exist for seniors, so we need to talk to them, ask them, get some insights and understanding of what it is about is it about lifestyle, health, what is it that they need? When we've done that, the question that we really wanted to know is what contributes to overall value. It was really a study about value, and there's been lots and lots and lots of studies done on value. So we had quite a good idea that we could use what was already done, add in what we had found out by doing the interviews with seniors, and then test it in a model that looked like that. All right? And basically in this, what we said, well, there are various things about stores that consumers like, the quality and choice of merchandise, the service orientation, the location convenience, all those sorts of things that stores can control that they use. But what we're interested in is more about the customer characteristics, the sorts of things in here that might matter. So we did a fairly large study to look at testing that structural model. Okay. I've been talking quite a bit about using some terms, and it can be very confusing when you first start. When the literature talks or you read about concepts, it's basically anything. Anything can be a concept. It's any idea. What we need to be able to talk about more specifically are variables, and it's just what the word says. A variable varies. It's something that can be measured because it varies in form from one time to another. And of course, then it can't be simple. You have to have independent, dependent, mediating, moderating, and various other types of variables, which I'm sure most of you would be familiar with. When we put variables together, maybe one or maybe more, we get what we call a construct. Now, in management and marketing research, in business research, we use constructs all the time. Constructs can't be measured. Could I have an example here? Excuse me. Sorry. Constructs can't be measured, but we measure things that enable us to get a feel for them. So here's an example for you. If I said to you, everyone has a mobile phone, and everyone therefore has a relationship with a telecommunications company, what do you think of your company? How loyal are you? Who's very loyal? Who's not very loyal? What does that mean? What does that mean?
How do you define loyal?
Exactly. How do you define loyal? And more, how do you measure it? If you're very loyal, what is that? What number are you? There isn't an absolute scale, is there? It's not like temperature. We can't say, well, very loyal is 200 and not loyal is 15. It just doesn't make sense. So a construct is something, usually attitudes in our research, that you can't measure directly. So what do we do? What do we have to do? We have to get indicators of that loyalty. So in this particular example, the indicators of loyalty might be, how likely are you to say positive things about your telco? So we can say on a scale of 1 to 5 or 7 or whatever, how likely is it? So that gives us a number which is an indicator of loyalty. Similarly, how likely are you to take your next contract? That also will give us an indicator. And how likely are you to recommend your telco to somebody else. So what we do with constructs is we find ways of indicators to tell us what they are. And so each of these is a variable, because each one can vary, right? And we can measure it. So we can measure them on a scale, and we put those together and we say this is how we measure loyalty. It's indicated by these three things. Make sense? Okay. All right. When you start reading and looking at things, you find models all the time. Now, what's the difference here? When we move to having a model, what we're doing is saying that there are links. We think there are links between the variables, and we come up with hypotheses about that. So this model says, okay, I think there's a link between customer focus and customer feedback. I think it's linked to loyalty. I think it's linked to quality. And I think they're linked to affective commitment, how customers feel about a company. This is a study that I did quite some years ago now. And this was the original model. So we've got customer orientation. It seems to have two dimensions. So there's two big variables there, if you like, that each one actually had a number of items within it, a number of sub-variables. And then there are hypotheses around this. If I said to you, name the dependent variable, what would you say? I know what you'd say. Don't ask questions. You're supposed to do the talking and we're supposed to sit here and just take it in. What's a dependent variable in this model? Can anyone like to hazard a guess? It's very hard to be the one to put your hand up and do the... Let me tell you, there's more than one.
Custom loyalty.
Loyalty is definitely one, isn't it? Because there are three pathways leading to customer loyalty, right? If you take customer loyalty, there are three independent variables. There's these, quality and commitment, that all lead into it. If we took affective commitment, customer commitment, and said, all right, we're just thinking about it in relation to quality and customer orientation, it's also a dependent variable if you consider those ones. But if you consider commitment and loyalty the way that I've structured this model, commitment leads to loyalty, so it would be the independent variable leading to the dependent variable. We generally put these from left to right, showing that these are vary leading to the dependent variables. But that's helpful when you're doing the diagram.
Maybe just in one sentence, if you could just give them what is dependent and what is independent. Those people who might not necessarily know.
Okay, so independent variable leading is, yeah, I've jumped ahead a bit much maybe. An independent variable will change, and then the dependent variable changes because of that. So how many people got the bus today might be a dependent variable. The independent variable might be something to do with the temperature or the amount of rain. So the amount of rain or whatever will affect, it will vary, and it will influence how many people took the bus. So one thing changes and therefore another thing changes. That makes sense? Not a very good example, but get the idea? And then we have mediating variables, and in this model, perceived service quality was hypothesised to mediate or transmit the effects in these parts. So when we're talking about mediation, we're talking about transmission of effects via something else. Make sense? Okay, I actually tested that model, and it was published quite some time ago, and that was what happened. That was what it looked like when I finished. Sorry, it's gone a bit, the line's gone a bit strange. And it was quite interesting. Well, what was very interesting to me was that, yes, we got the two dimensions of service orientation for all the workers, customer focus and customer feedback. And customer focus, which was about understanding customers' needs, wanting to help them, that sort of thing, had a direct path. Yes, direct path to customer loyalty, but it also had an indirect path mediated by quality. Right? So there was a transmitted that way, it went directly, but customer feedback didn't have a path to service quality. So when we asked people how they felt, it didn't affect what they said about quality, but it did affect how they felt about the organisation. All right? And how they feel about the organisation is related to their loyalty. So this matters because there is a path going that way. Right? This is the thinking part at the end, interpreting the results, thinking about what they mean. Okay. Well, I've told you that. All right? You could all pass the test on that, couldn't you? Yes? You know I'm not giving you a test, so you don't really care. All right. Let's move on to thinking about hypotheses. Some of you are probably very comfortable with hypotheses. They're unproven statements. We use them to test theory, and they usually have direction. Something is positively or negatively related. One gets bigger, the other gets bigger, that's positive. One gets bigger, the other gets smaller, that's negative. A lot of books will recommend that you use null hypotheses. If we're not sure, there's not enough literature, or there's confusion, we say there will be no link. And what we do is set out to disprove that. Right? So if you want to read something really hard, you read a book by a man called Shelby Hunt, and it's called The Theory of Marketing, and it takes about 5 hours to read 3 pages. But he explains all this idea about what is science, what is testing, what is hypothesis, and so on. All right? The most important thing is that we can't say we've ever proven anything because things change over time. And we find other circumstances where they might be different. All right, when we do tests, we're looking for something that is either in the simplest form a difference or an association. Is there a difference between two groups, or is there a link? One gets stronger, the other gets stronger, or one gets stronger, the other gets weaker. In its simplest form, that's what hypotheses almost always do. Are two groups different, or are they linked? So here's a couple of simple examples for you. I'm sure you know what Xbox is. I didn't know when I read this, but it's found out it's one of those game things that. And I thought, okay, this will be very true. Males have a greater awareness of Xbox than females. Yes, yes, that's true. I've tested it on my marketing research class. There's 2 variables here, right? The 2 variables are their awareness of Xbox and their gender. All right, males and females. So, and there is a difference between the groups. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Oops. I might just try. Something terrible's happening. Anyone got any suggestions? Anyone got any suggestions? Yeah. I'm very pleased we're a woman. It's a bit like the Xbox thing.
I'm working in the same room every day, that's why I chunked out. Would you like to show this?
No, we're just at the bottom of that one. Yeah, keep going there. Just keep right down the bottom. That's it. Ah! Well, what was on the bottom? This is to test if you're awake. On the bottom of that slide, there is a positive relationship between age and awareness. Okay, there's a positive relationship between age and awareness. So what would you predict? That as people get older, they become more aware or less aware of computer games and things? Yeah, less. I don't think that's still the case, but yeah, at the time when this was really, we older people now are pretty good on those sorts of things, and we have the time to muck around. All right. You think I could go back to big picture?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just summarise this and keep moving on. I want to get to the next objective about purpose statements, because that's really important. Identify the big picture problem that usually requires action if you're doing applied business research. So what's the issue, problem, why is it important, what's the relevance of it? Then we come up with research questions of some sort, and we take those questions. If you're doing quantitative study or if you think there are links, you have hypotheses. Those hypotheses then lead you to some survey questions. So, you know, people say that when you do research, some of you would have heard that you should do this, what do you call it, egg timer, you know, that funnel type thing. In fact, you do it twice. You start with the big picture, you bring it down to specific questions, you think about what you need to know to answer those questions. So you actually expand it out at this point when you collect your data. Then when you've got your data, you've got to bring it back in again. You've got to say, what does that data mean? So we actually have to collapse the data again, bring it back down to something else in the analysis phase. We bring it down, we contract it again, and we say, all right, this is what we found in relation to the research questions. This is what it means for theory. When we're talking about research questions, information, this is what it means for theory. Then we say, what does it mean in terms of the big problem? So you bring it out again, what does it mean in terms of action or practical applications? So you've got to do both. Okay? All right, let me give you a couple of examples of PhD students with whom I've worked in the past. This is Maliga. She was a Malaysian student who spent a few years in Australia, and I supervised her thesis. Notice here I've put spatial technology adoption and retail businesses in Australia in different colour. Can anyone guess why? No? Very mysterious. If you have what, in my opinion, a good title of a PhD or a master's or any sort of research project will say what the area of theory is, and it will give something about context. What was the theory that she was working on? Spatial technology adoption. What was the context of her study? Retail businesses in Australia. All right? So, the big picture is related to retail businesses in Australia. The theory is about spatial technology adoption. All right. So when you think about the problem when I think about the problem that she was working on, businesses need to choose retail locations. There's an increased availability of expert systems, graphical information systems in her case. We didn't understand anything about the priorities of businesses in adopting it, so we wanted to find out, we wanted to test spatial technology in that way. Now, when Maliga did her thesis, which is going back about 5 years, there was already a lot done on technology adoption. A lot. Heaps. There just wasn't a great deal done specifically in relation to GIS, and they were her sponsors. So what she did first in a small study was interviews with managers. She was able to get a model from the literature because there's a lot done. She interviewed managers to see if there was anything else that should be put in there, and then she needed to identify what she was actually going to ask in some of the areas. So interviewing people, you can take the words that they use and turn them into items that you put on a survey or questions that you might ask. And then her major study was to do a survey, and she had analysed it using quantitative analysis, structural models. All right? I've probably covered this, I'll just run through it quickly. There's lots of prior literature on information technology and information systems. So we didn't do qualitative work, not really. It was going to be a quantitative study. We wanted to test relationships. So the examples of hypotheses that she had were perceived usefulness of technology will be positively related at the direction to attitude to adoption. Perceived service value will be positively related to attitude. Straight out hypotheses that we can test. We developed scales, we looked at the pathways, and then we said hypotheses are supported or not. That's a classic, typical quantitative study. All right? Okay, here's another one. This student is Kanika. She's an Indian international student in Australia who I supervised. Have a look at the colours on the title here. What area of theory was she working in? Social capital, loyalty and value co-creation. And the context of her work was senior consumers and third places. Third places are places that are not home or work. Cafes, you know, community centres, things like that. All right. If we were talking about the importance of her work or why this research needed doing, there's a growth in senior consumers worldwide. They're living a lot longer. The life expectancy is increased dramatically in lots of countries. How do we support their well-being? What's going on? We know that they need things to help them to fill their lives, to have good quality of life, but we don't know anything about those birthplaces. So she was looking at this. Her work was very much about focus groups, interviews, participant observation. She went and she had a good time. Well, mostly she had a good time. Mostly you have a good time when you do research. She actually visited all these seniors groups and she sat with them and played cards with them and went on trips with them and did all those sorts of things, as well as doing formal interviews. She did a lot of participant observation where she actually participated and at the same time she observed and took note in relation to things like how they interact with one another, what's important to them, where do people tend to sit, how do they respond, all sorts of things like that. So basically her work, I'll just move on, was about understanding the details about the role and importance of these other places where people go, places outside of home and work, to improve the quality of life. This is where the social capital theory came in. It was about quality of life. No hypothesis. No hypothesis. Because it's a qualitative study. We're exploring and finding insights and meaning. Okay? And there wasn't a lot of literature on this specific topic. So we were using open-ended questions, looking, asking, listening, but not testing. You're not testing. So you can never use directional words. So you don't say something has an effect or an impact. You use very non-directional words around understanding. Okay, so examples of the sorts of questions: why do you visit this club? And lots and lots and lots of words. How does it make you feel? Lots and lots and lots of words. Then you have to do the really hard thing, which is take all those hundreds of pages of words and make sense of them. And that's why you need to have the technical skills of what we call content analysis. What's in here? How do we make sense of it? Okay, moving on. So Kanika's work was looking at topics and themes to develop or extend theory. Right? So she was actually developing and extending, and it was a typical qualitative. Okay, this is a good time for you to think and for me to have a glass of water. If you had think about a research problem. It might be the one something that you're working on, your master's question, or something that you'd like to research if you're not doing a higher degree at the moment. Something that you'd like to investigate, and then you should be able to say, what's the overall problem or topic? What's the relevance of it, and why does it matter? All right. Then the second thing, what is the information that we will need? So what are the research questions that will anchor your work in theory? What do we need to know? All right, I'll give you 30 seconds to see if you can do that for your own little question. This is wake up time, everybody. And I won't embarrass you by asking you, but this is where I usually say to my students, it'd be a good idea to pick up a pen, and start writing something. Or you have to type. Showing my age again. Okay, 30 seconds is up to me to keep moving along. Until you can do this, you're not framing your research. You have to be able to say, what's the relevance of your work and why does it matter? And then you have to be able to say, well, what's the information that we need to know? Right? It's called the deficiency model. Now, you may or may not have hypotheses. Sometimes we don't. Sorry, I've just moved on quickly there. What I am going to do now is move on from that to the third objective, which is about writing purpose statements. And this leads you directly into writing a purpose statement. Okay, the purpose of your work. In most of the resources, and I've given you a list of references at the end, and there are a couple of excellent references in relation to writing, getting started on your work and writing the introduction. This one is, these first slides here are taken from a book by Creswell, who's an American who's published quite a lot of books on designing quantitative and qualitative and mixed methods. If you want a good basic book, his is very easy to read. These first 4 slides, the next 4 slides, are taken, summarised from the chapters in his book about writing an introduction to your study. Now, the introduction to your study has to be good. Why does it have to be good? Because if someone's reading your work and they read the first paragraph and they can't understand it, they don't read anymore. It's sunk. You know, if you're grading a student assignment, how long does it take you to decide whether it's good or bad? Any suggestions?
1 second.
1 minute, even less, doesn't it? In fact, sometimes if I'm doing a longer research methods class, I actually hand out some student work, unnamed, and say, what grade did this paper get? Just the first page. And even if the students know nothing about the area, they know straight away whether it's a good paper or a bad paper. Yeah, you think about it, it's true. You can tell immediately. It's the same with your research work. If your introduction is not good, it sets a very bad tone and it's very hard to come back. It's a bit like if you have a very big breakfast and you start off the day eating chocolates, the day doesn't usually finish well. In a dietary sense, it has to be good. So you want to set the scene well. What does good mean? Or what does that mean? It means having a very clear focus and framework. Let me assure you, this is not easy, and even the most experienced researchers have to work at it and put several iterations. You do drafts, you think about it, you show it to someone, and they say, I don't get it. All right? So you need to work on this part. When you're doing it, I think if you follow the same pattern that I've been talking about here, what's the relevance of this work? Why does it matter? What do we already know from the literature or from other sources? Therefore, what do we need to find out? What are our questions? What's the significance when we've done it? What does it matter for each target audience, academics and managers? Okay? Now, I've called this particular objective in this part of the presentation about the purpose statement. I think the purpose statement is a very useful term, and I've made this up. It's a summary of intent with respect to theory. It summarises what you're going to do in relation to theory. We've moved down from the relevance, the action, into the purpose of the work. Now, these 4 slides about the introduction taken from the Creswell book sort of lead into that. So I'm going to move through them very quickly because I want to get to the purpose statement. The aim of the introduction, Creswell says there are 4 things. Number 1, establish the problem. Be convincing about the contribution. You have to believe in it. Otherwise, it'll come through and you won't convince anybody else. Tell your story. So you start with the broad perspective, lead in, explain why it matters, start to focus, evidence, and then make it understandable. Now, notice here. What's that say? What's that got to do with me? This bit. When I was doing my PhD as a very mature age student, I had several different supervisors for various reasons. And my last supervisor said, well, I'll supervise you, come and tell me about your work. So we sat down and she said, what are you doing? So I told her what I was doing, or I thought I'd told her what I was doing. And she said, I didn't understand a word of it. I didn't understand a word of it. That's way too complicated. What would you say if I was sitting next to you on the plane? All right? And I've used it often with my students. If you can't put it into words that the person sitting next to you on the plane could understand, it's not clear enough. All right? You've got to be able to state very simply what it is and what you're doing, the problem that you're addressing. And Creswell, referring back to this source, he says you have to lower the reader slowly so you don't plunge them into deep, dark, unknown and unfriendly places. So you don't start using words, that are technical or way too specific in terms of theory. You keep it, you've got to have it very clear. And it's the same if you're writing a proposal and you want money from a company. It has to be in their language. It has to be simple enough to be able to be understood by the person on the plane. I just use that as a way of thinking about it. Here's another one of my PhD students, Garda. She graduated last year. And she did interaction, experiences and outcomes of value co-creation in banking in Saudi Arabia. This was her story. This was the way she set up the story. There's been extensive technology adoption worldwide, including in developing countries such as Saudi Arabia, and I'm sure it's the same in Estonia. My hotel's free Wi-Fi, and it's everywhere, isn't it? There's extensive technology adoption. At the same time, there's a growth of multi-channel services in banking. Most banks now have lots of multi-channel services. So that's the big picture things, isn't it? All right. In terms of the theory, she said there's also been a lot of work about co-creation of value. We want to know what consumers value in relation to technology and multi-channel. There's been a lot done on co-creation. We know a little bit about what features customers value. So her basic question said, well, all right, what don't we know? What's unclear in multi-channel services? And how can service dominant logic help us understand those things? So you make a story from what's happening, why is it relevant, what does it mean? There's a lot of growth in multi-channel banking. We want to know what customers value, why it's important to them. So we need to look at value. There's this thing about co-creation of value, but it's very unclear what that means in multi-channel. So I'm going to find that out. That's what she did. She got a PhD. So the second aim of the introduction is to put your work into the literature, to get the areas that define your work. You need to be able to say, my work is predominantly in something or other. All right, service management, bring it down, whatever it is. When you're putting the problem in the literature, it's not a series of summaries, all right, and it's not specific. It's much more general about what we know, what we don't know, what the studies are, all right? I mentioned before about having to integrate to say what are the debates or what are the issues and challenges. Now, most academic papers have a list of citations at the end of various things. There is nothing more annoying to an examiner or a reader if you just repeat the same list of 20 citations without any idea of what they did or what they mean, all right? You only put citations where they're relevant to what you've just said, and they highlight who the people are. It's not often that you will have 15 citations in a row. You might want to make a point to say there's been a lot of work done, but the idea of citations is that when I read it, I can go to those articles and I can find out more if I want to. Okay? So it is proving that you've done it, but it's also enabling other people to get in and have a look. Okay, so you put your problem in the literature, and that helps you. This is called the deficiency model, the gaps, where are the deficiencies. And that flows on to what's not happened. All right?
Sorry, Alison.
Yeah?
Did you want to mention anything on secondary referencing and about the importance of actually going to the primary source?
Why don't you add that?
One of the things I've actually caught a number of my students out on over the years is that they'll read an article which makes a lot of sense to them. They actually enjoy the arguments within that article. And within that article, there'll be references to other literature, other articles that may be relevant in them helping to form their arguments. And it's very tempting just to cite those articles without actually going to the primary source. And it's actually it's very important. Actually, the point I was actually making is in terms of that story development and in terms of understanding, placing your work within literature, to always go to the primary source. So if you see an article to cite it, because quite often they may have cited it incorrectly themselves, you're just going to repeat that error if you don't go to the primary article and actually understand whether or not they're citing it correctly, whether or not the arguments they're making are consistent with the arguments you want to make. And subtle differences can really undermine the credibility of your own research. That was just the only point I was going on.
Yeah, that's good. Any questions for Byron about that? You understand what he's saying? What he said so clearly?
There is also one more thing. Some people will not only cite without going into the previous article, but also cited from. In articles you will find that, and that's a no-no for any good journals. You cannot cite cited from. it has to be that you read and you understood, and therefore you are quoting or referring that particular paper, not that somebody else has cited and you are just copying it.
There's no way you get out of doing the work, is what you're saying. You have to go to the sources yourself and read them yourself. All right, let's move on. So when you get to this part of the introduction, we're looking at what you need to do. And this is what I call the however part. All right? We say, I've given you an example here. Despite the growth in call centres worldwide, there's thousands of them everywhere, and the interest in service delivery, very few studies have investigated service quality in call centres. All right? So this is the however. That leads you into what I've called the however part. All right? However, we don't know these things, so we need to find them out. And that then takes you into the therefore part. We need to find out these things. Therefore, this study will investigate blah blah in this particular context, in call centres in Australia or whatever it is. Right? So you've got the however and the therefore part. Very important that you can say that. And your phrases should reflect the debates and challenges. So you use phrases to do that. Yes?
Yeah, I just have one question. I think from your point, you said that you are more using the gap model to construct the research questions and to make the paper very interesting. But based on our thesis studies, I read one of the book, and the author is challenged with the gap model. He said the gap model is not innovative, and it's only extend the existing theory. So what do you think about this opinion?
Look, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
That it's not innovative because it restricts you to thinking about that literature, but you can be innovative in the way you bring other things in. So if you think back to one of the PhDs, the first one, Maliga, she did spatial technology adoption in Australia. Now there were lots of models of spatial technology adoption. What she did was take those models, and she said none of them have included service value. All right, perceived service value and so on. So she actually brought some other things in. But you're right, this is the debate in positivist paradigm, criticising positivist paradigm. I haven't gone into paradigms. It depends on your worldview and how you think things should move forward. Keep pursuing it, it's interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, he said the gap model is not the future of to make a scientific article. What do you think about this?
Whether the gap model is the future or not, I think if you're going to be a good researcher, you need to understand what's happened, where it's come from, and what's the pattern of research development, like any theoretical development. I think qualitative research, not looking at the gap model, is a very, very interesting way forward. Very interesting. But there won't be as well. Maybe my colleagues can comment on this, but there won't be as many people who will be confident about helping you in those other alternative approaches. People are more comfortable, you get some numbers and you toss them around. But we can talk about it later. I think they're very important points. All right, let's move on. So coming to the fourth aim of the introduction, the fourth thing the introduction needs to do is tell your audience why it matters. All right? Who needs to know? You've usually got two audiences, so I've said here, is your academic or your theoretical contribution, and then you've got your practical or your managerial ones. So, for example, if you're looking at particular studies, this one that I've just put here, with a colleague from Singapore, we looked at some studies in China, and we said, okay, we know about value in retail in other countries, but none of this has been tested in China. What does it mean in the Chinese context? And she talked about the cultural differences and why it might matter. And then what are the different demographic groups? And then taking those, what does that mean in terms of management? So what can managers do? What are the things that leads to there? So this coming back to the action, right? So what factors constitute value? So what can managers do? What are the differences for demographic groups? So what groups do you want to appeal to? How are you going to appeal to them? So your theoretical should lead directly to your practical. One of the very annoying things when you're reviewing papers is people do practical applications at the end of it. They've got nothing to do with their work. They'll write up this good study, And then they'll say, well, practical applications, managers should train their employees. No, they should. But it's nothing to do with what you've been talking about, loyalty and inertia or whatever it is you've been talking about. So your practical applications need to relate to your study, and they're often not done very well. You need to think about what does it mean for my two audiences, the theoretical and the practical. All right, I'd like to move on. I've given you a reference there by a scholar called Summers, and he gives a template for writing an introduction, which is a very useful exercise. I think there's actually a better one in a later slide, which we'll get to in a minute. But you can use this one. It's bigger, and it tells you the steps. So if you want to write an introduction of your thinking, this Summers article is very, very good, very useful. You can actually go and get it, and then try and fill in the gaps here. And he actually tells you, you might say here, loyalty researchers, people working in a specific area have devoted considerable attention to develop and testing models of customer loyalty, service loyalty. So you give several prominent articles as your citations. Previous research has addressed several aspects. First of all, testing me here, what might we have done in relation to loyalty? We might have done repeat purchasing, might be the first thing. So some citations about who's done work on that. We might have done word of mouth recommendations, some citations on that. And the third one might be, what else is about loyalty? Repeat purchasing.
Cognitive, affective.
Sorry?
Cognitive and affective.
Too hard. Behavioural intention, yes, behavioural intention, that's good. So, you know, what are the key things that are talked about in relation to loyalty and who's done them? So you're showing the author, you're showing the reader that you know the main authors, you know where the work is coming from. So you do that. However, in addition, Keating and Solnit, these two scholars over here, encompass several unexplored dimensions that have attracted research attention in other disciplines. They've been looking at it with respect to sociology and information technology, or whatever it is. So that's the thing. That's the however part. However part, right? Some of these unexplored areas, or whatever it is, appear to be important in the context of developing countries, or whatever it is, wherever you want to place your work. It's important because blah, blah. So it's very helpful to have a template and make sure that you can tell the story. Because until you can tell the story, no one else will understand the story. All right, so the purpose and contribution of the work. In this study, we seek to extend the theory of loyalty by addressing the gaps in whatever it is, word of mouth or whatever you're doing. And then specifically what your work is going to do. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Now, just a couple of things that I've put here on the bottom that didn't come from the Summers article. When you're reading an article or a thesis, sometimes you get pages and pages of contributions. And as a reader, you get totally lost. So you need to be able to make clear the major contributions. Where is the major contribution of this work? There might be 5 contributions. You might find some interesting things, but what's the major contribution? What do you see as the big deal thing about your research? If someone said to you, well, why was this study so important? Well, it's so important because I found, going back to the previous study, customer feedback doesn't influence quality, right, in the customer's mind. That was the major contribution. That in that particular paper, the major contribution was at the front end of the model, it wasn't at the back end. It was about that first part. Right? So you need to be able to talk about contributions and why they're important. I'm not quite sure why I put that there. Note that the final sentence is the purpose statement. I think I mean this. But you might like to put a question mark. That's a puzzle for you, which I don't have the answer. All right, so wrapping up this objective, the purpose statement gives the overall intent or purpose of a study. If you're going to do research, you put in a lot of time, a lot of personal energy, you need to understand why you're doing it. What's the purpose of this study? It's what I've called the theoretical guiding light. It tells you how to stay on track in relation to your work for the whole research process, all the steps. So it gives you that direction that you need, and it flows directly from your introduction. That's why I put those slides there. So if you work through your story, work through your introduction, you should then be able to state very clearly what your purpose statement is. Sometimes it's the very first statement in the paper. Some journals like that, and some authors like to write like that. It should be concise and clear, but it has to give the reader a snapshot. Now, it is not an abstract. It's not a picture of the whole study. It's about the purpose of the work. Okay? And the study will not be clear until you can write it. So until you can say to the person on the plane, I am doing my work in something or other because of something or other, it's not clear enough in your head. And until it's clear in your head, you can't make it clear to other people. All right, here's some examples of purpose statements. I've just selected 3. And because I used that model of loyalty and customer commitment, I've taken the purpose statement that I wrote when I did that paper. This study investigated how the perceived customer orientation of call centre employees relates to service quality and is translated into affective commitment and customer loyalty. All right, see how the context is there, the major variables are there, and the main testing is there. All right. Then the other thing that I thought was really important about this, perceived customer orientation was represented by the 2 dimensions of customer focus and customer feedback. As identified in previous call centre research, they've been found to be important, and so that's taken directly from that paper. Here's a different one. This is a qualitative study. This study applied the grounded theory method. Straight away, this is what we did. We used grounded theory to the social phenomenon of beer consumption in Australia. Students would have loved it. All right? The objective was to generate a substantive theory. So it's qualitative work. The objective of the work is to generate a substantive theory of beer consumption that describes the processes involved in this ubiquitous activity. Now, I think that's very interesting at the end, but it's not terribly clear, but it was the best qualitative statement I could find at the time I thought it was the most interesting one I could find at the time when I was putting these slides together. You should see how it gives a totally different focus. It's qualitative, it's loose, you're not testing things, you're building up a theory. Here's a third type.
What was the theory, Alison?
Well, that's why I don't think it's good. But you know, she does actually, it's another category in Western Australia, she does actually finish with a theory that can then be tested in ongoing studies. I think you should look up the reference. Yeah. She did an amazing, it's an amazing amount of data. Like, I forget the details, but thousands of pages. She went to pubs, she had a good time. She did participant evaluations and watched, observed, and took notes. Right? Or she had students doing it for her, I don't know. She's an academic in Western Australia. But it's quite, you know, that's something that captures interest because it's an everyday thing that we all like. The next one is the opposite. The next one is the purpose statement from a very famous paper by Barron and Kenny. Is anyone familiar with that paper? It's about mediation and moderation. It's one of the papers that gets cited all the time in how to test for mediation. You've got the reference if you want to look it up. What they say in the introduction to their paper is the purpose of this analysis is to distinguish between the properties of moderator and mediator variables. We know straight away what we're going to get out of it. We're going to find out about moderator and mediator variables and the difference between them. All right? In such a way as to clarify the different ways in which conceptual variables may account for differences in people's behaviour. So what they actually did, it's a conceptual discussion using previous research. So it's not quant or qual, it's a discussion based on their taking a whole lot of previous research and building arguments around moderation and mediation. Does that make sense to you? You must be able to write this statement and put it somewhere in your introduction. I've just given you a little summary here, which is taken from Creswell, that same reference. And there are a number of references. Creswell, you might be able to get that one, but there are various other ones he's done as well. And if you're going to write a purpose statement, these are, if it's basically a quantitative study, I've given here what you need to do. State the purpose using the names of the major variables. What are the key things? All right? The conceptual basis, there might be a theory or model. So you might say the theory of loyalty. or whatever it is. The type of study, is it going to be a survey, questionnaire survey, is it going to be an experiment? What are you going to do? Will the test involve relationships? Is it differences between groups, or is it testing links? What's the unit of analysis and context? Is it based on differences between work groups, teams of workers, or is it based on individuals? Are you comparing China and Estonia and Australia? And what's the outcome going to be? And then you need to use the sort of language that reflects that. If you do the first parts well, that will happen naturally. If you're doing a qualitative study, it's much less structured, but you will generally have some sort of introductory, controlling, guiding type of idea. And you might have a broad definition of it first, which develops and changes as you get into the work. So qualitative study is much harder to be prescriptive, and this is what you must do and say in the first instance. Nevertheless, you need to be able to say, what's the type of study that you're going to do? Is it a case study? Is it grounded theory? Is it an ethnographic study where you're going to look at a certain group of people and the way things happen? Your methodology will have words like explore, develop, discover, rather than test, explain, those sorts of things. Again, the same things, the group and the context. All right, I like these two slides. So if you don't do anything else, mark or put a little asterisk next to these two. I think these are very useful. I've taken them from Creswell, and you just fill in the gaps. Be able to fill in the gaps when you're writing about your research. The purpose of this, what type of study was it? Survey, research, is, was, will be. To test the theory of loyalty that compares, relates, what does it do? Inertia to behavioural intentions for consumers of mobile technology at Palmyra, Estonia. I've just made it up, obviously. You just fill it in, get all that clear. Then, if it's a quantitative study, define the variables. You see, when we talk about loyalty, some people, if you're talking about customer loyalty, is it a repeat purchase? Is it what people say that they'll come back? Is it what they say to other people? Define what you mean by it. All right, what are you using? Or is it a combination? And so on. So you need to define them and talk about what your controls. Usual controls are things like age, gender, education, income, country of origin, those sorts of things. The qualitative study, this Creswell text also gives a purpose statement for qualitative study that you can use. I think this is really helpful. The purpose of the study is what? To understand, describe, develop. What is it trying to do? What is it you're looking at? All right? How are you going to do it? It will result in what will be the outcome of your research. For who, at where. Okay? So I've gone over those quickly, but take them and use them. Think about the purpose of your work, and you must be able to put it into very clear language. And if you're doing a qualitative study, you should be able to put some sort of general discussion about where your starting point is. But in qualitative work, that tends to move on and can be quite different. All right, I've talked a lot, so we haven't got time to do this, but I think when you go home and you think about your own work, you need to be able to write a statement that says the purpose of this study is to, all right, and use those scripts as a guide to make sure that you can do it. I was going to get you to do one for a few minutes, and for people who sat there and said, well, I don't know, I haven't started, I was going to say, all right, use these, one of these two studies to do it. And the point I wanted to make here is the purpose statement will be very close to the overall research question. All right? The purpose statement is the theoretical guide. And if you look at the study that Maliga did about adoption of expert information systems to aid decision making, that was what hers was about. The purpose of the study was to test relationships between perceptions of technology and perceptions of service on retailers' attitudes. Okay? Kanika, who had a much more open and loose sort of study where she was looking at the role and importance of third places in terms of quality of life, her research question is much more open. So the purpose of her study was to explore the role that third places play in enhancing senior social engagement and so on. Make sense? All right. You'll be pleased to know we're nearly done. The research, so this is the research process that I've been talking about, and I've very much focused on this part about understanding where you're going, getting the purpose written for your study. When you've done that, you can then do the design, how you're going to do it. When you've done the design, you can write your proposal. So at this stage, continuing on, if you're working through this, what's your problem, what's your questions? Then you say, okay, what's your main type of design? Now, you've got methodologies, which are the deficiency model, or quantitative or qualitative, the paradigm, the methodology. Then what's easier is the method. So how are you going to do it? What's the actual processes that you're going to use to collect data? Will it be interviews, will it be questionnaire or whatever? And then something, a little bit about analysis. When you're doing a proposal, most companies don't want to know about all that detail, about the analysis, all those things that are really interesting to researchers. They want to know what information they're going to get at the end, which will support decision making and actions, and probably investment of resources. So the final objective is just to summarise what goes in a research proposal. And if you recall, the first 3 steps in the process that I set out at the beginning, the problem, the literature and the design, those 3 things, they give you your proposal. All right? They give you your research proposal. When you do the next 3 steps, you put it together and you get a research thesis or report. Make sense? So when you do your master's dissertation or whatever it is, your proposal takes you to there, but all of this enables you to write your report. Okay. Some people say, all you've got to do when you're writing a proposal is what, why, how, where and when. I've never been able to do that, so I've given up time to use those as the main headings in a proposal, but they are useful. What do you intend to study? What's the scope of it? What's your question? Why it needs to be studied, the relevance, how you intend to do it, what are you going to do, where will you conduct it and when. What they do is actually provide the content for a research proposal. This is more useful, I think, because this is usually what you would expect to find in a research proposal. These are the headings. What's the introduction? Right? Introduction, what's the problem, significance, very, very brief review of the literature, very brief, especially if you're doing it for companies. What's your method, how are you going to do it, what's your plan, and this is where it's important if you're doing a proposal to get support, when, who you need to help you, what resources are needed, the really practical things need to come out in the end there, and then you need to have your references from reputable sources that show that this study is worthwhile. Okay, there's the references for you that I referred to. Sorry about that, a little bit wonky there. They should all be fairly readily available, except this last one, which is probably not so readily available, but it's an excellent reference if you can get hold of it. Sorry, I just ran right to the last minute. Yes?
Can we receive the presentation? Is it possible
To get the slides?
Yeah,
of course.
Perfect.
I'll give them to you. The girl has got them. She can hand them out to anyone who'd like them. Saves you writing. Saves you writing. Students don't use pens anymore. Any other questions? I'm sorry, I've run right to 10:30. But look, I'll be around all day, and I'll be around the next few days. I'm happy to talk to anyone, or if you've got any questions. If you want to go home and do an exercise writing out your purpose statement, come and see me, and I'll give you a mark out of 10. Yeah.
Alison, thank you for the presentation. I have a question about introduction writing. When we write introduction, should we include some industrial facts? That's just say like co-creation. The industry has practiced extensively, but the theory is lagging behind.
Yeah.
So should we include some?
Look, usually the relevance of the study is very important, and it might be industrial facts. You're talking about adoption of technology in Estonia. You might say, over the past 5 years, 2 million households are connected to the internet, and you have some source which is not an academic source, but it shows why your study is important, what the relevance is to.
Yeah, because I've learned in the class that yearly state this fact, this aspect has not been investigated previously is not enough
No,
for the industry gap, because we have to connect to the industry.
it must have the big picture actions, why it matters, the relevance up front. And then you come into, that's the action or the relevance, then the information is the research that we do. What does the information mean for the big picture, the action and relevance?
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.